Welcome back to class. We just completed our work on Deuteronomy 17:14 to 20, the law of Yahweh's king, and I want to give a few remarks on it to try to bring out some of the theological, ethical, and canonical dimensions that really permeate out of this text. This text is critical for understanding the ethics of Deuteronomy, for understanding the Deuteronomistic history that's going to come after it, the way that Israel tells the story of its history from Joshua all the way through 2 Kings. And in particular, it has implications for understanding what kingship is. You may have noticed in Scripture that sometimes it sounds like the Bible was happy and wanted Israel to have a king. Other times it sounds like God wasn't particularly pleased that Israel had a king. So kind of what gives? Well, all that comes back into this passage where this gives a portrait of what kingship was supposed to look like in ancient Israel. So let's listen to this text, and I'll make a few comments about it as we go through there. First, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it. Now, what this assumes, what kingship assumes, is land as gift, as God's people coming into a land that's been a gift. And that's a theme that runs throughout Deuteronomy. It's the giftedness. It goes back to God's grace, God's graciousness. And one of the questions that we've talked about when we were together is, what is the response of God's people to God's graciousness? And the theme that we've seen, and we saw this established in the Shema, is it's faithfulness. It's faithful obedience. The Shema talks about loving the Lord our God, loving the Lord your God with all that you are, with all your heart, with all your thoughts, wills, decision-making, with all that you are, and then even more than that. And so that's the central focus. In many ways, Israel's laws, as you've probably already got a sense as you've continued to read through Deuteronomy since our class time, is that a lot of it really is, in a sense, application or commentary on this command to love God. Whether it's the 10 Commandments, the first few of those commandments, or as we saw in Deuteronomy 5 to 11, or these initial laws in this book of the law the section that we're in now, it's what's it mean to love God? Well, one of the part of it is a recognition of the giftedness and the land is as a result of God's graciousness. And so how do we respond to that? We respond with, as we've said, faithfulness. It's a key word for Deuteronomy. Or faithful obedience. You can throw all those other Deuteronomy words in here. Love, cling, fear, keep, and so on. All of those great words give us a vocabulary, a relational vocabulary that helps to remind us that Israel is in the land. God's people have the blessings that they've received because of God's prior acts of graciousness and God's ongoing graciousness. And so when we talk about kingship, kingship has to be rooted again in God's grace. And so when you come into the land that the Lord has promised and He's given you, settled in it, and when you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. And this is where the distinction is. Israel's allowed to have a king in the same way that other nations have a king, but the type of kingship that this text establishes has some qualitative differences with the way that kingship was conducted in the areas around Israel. So the next set of verses give a set of prohibitions that are to separate Israel's ideas about kingship away from how kingship was done elsewhere. And so verses 15 through 17, be sure to appoint over you the king whom the Lord your God chooses. Again, this could be ideological or religious lip service because, of course, whoever the king is has been chosen by God. Every king that's ever reigned would say they are reigning at the will of God. But in this case, Yahweh actually means it. And he lays some specific prohibitions here, or some specific negative descriptors that are to define kingship here, at least in negative terms. So instead of being a foreign ruler, he has to actually be an Israelite. So Israel can't be ruled by someone who's outside of the covenant community. Now, in our text for next week, which is going to be from Deuteronomy 23, there's the issue of exclusion. And Deuteronomy has some real exclusionary terms about foreigners, but most of those have to do with religious fidelity. So the idea is not just a foreigner, because presumably a foreigner could come and be part of Israel, but by doing that, they would actually become an Israelite. So this isn't so much just simply xenophobia here, or xenophobic reactions by Israel's. This is God saying you're not going to have someone who doesn't share your core values, your commitment to Yahweh, your commitment to justice, all the things that are in the book of the law. So the Israelite king has to be an Israelite, meaning if they're male, a circumcised male is able to participate in Passover, and who now considers himself part of that Exodus generation that the book assumes all the way through. So it has to be an Israelite. The second thing is, and this is significant, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. This is significant for a couple of things. I want to start making a couple of remarks here. Again, this person has to be the king, has to be an Israelite. That's in terms of identity. But in terms of functions, the person can't acquire too many horses. Now, when you look at horses, this isn't just collecting horses for horse racing or whatever. The horse, what you want to think of that, in the modern world, this would be like a tank. Or maybe even more significant, I would suggest that this is more like having F-21s, or in other words, these are your fighters. This is the most powerful weapon at your disposal. In the ancient world, horses, at least at this time, weren't used primarily as one person on a horse like in a cavalry, but instead the horse was the puller of a chariot, which was essentially a war vehicle. And so this is all about military power here. And notice how it says, don't make the people return back to Egypt. That's not just saying sending people down to Egypt to get the horses. The suggestion here is don't trade free Israelites, in other words, selling them into slavery as commodities to be sold to finance your military. Really significant there. And the backdrop against what we have coming up here is going to be none other than King Solomon. Solomon is the negative example of this. A lot of times when we think of the bad king in the scriptures, we think about Jeroboam the first, but it's actually Solomon. And when we look at Solomon's story, again, it starts off really good at the beginning of 1 Kings, but once Solomon builds the temple, we begin to have some real issues with Solomon. We know that Solomon used slave labor and forced labor to build things, but once we get into chapters 9 and 10, Solomon begins taking lots of extra wives. He goes down to Egypt and buys horses. So like in chapter 10, verse 26, it said Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. He imported them from Egypt. Elsewhere, it suggests that Solomon traded land for the resources to build the temple with. And so Solomon traded stuff, and perhaps even there was a sense that Solomon traded maybe even perhaps in slavery. We don't want to push that detail too much, but the issue here is military and how it's paid for. And so, again, God's the real king, and so does Israel need lots of military? The answer is no, because if Israel trusted in the Lord protected them. So this is about self-reliance at some level. Okay, so no horses. Verse 17, he must not take many wives or his heart will be led astray. No many wives. And the key thing here, this isn't so much about promiscuity. I mean, there's plenty of things in the scriptures that talk about issues of sexual immorality, but this isn't necessarily talking about sexual immorality here. What's the issue for not having too many wives is so that his heart will not be led astray. Well, why might his heart be led astray? It's because he's entering into essentially political marriages with another ruler, and so he's bringing in a wife or another concubine into his house who's bringing foreign religious practices in. And when you read Solomon's story, he began building centers of worship for his other wives. So that's the issue. This isn't a sexual ethic prohibition for a king. There's plenty of other places in scriptures that talk about that. This is talking about power politics, essentially. Versus fidelity to Yahweh. Is in the same way the military is versus trusting in Yahweh's protection. And we know that Solomon, lots of horses, lots of wives. And then the last thing it says, as far as a negative, in verse 17, not going to overaccumulate wealth. And so notice this is a critique. This isn't a king. Most kings, again, want to bolster themselves up with a powerful military, have lots of wives, lots of political power, and make lots of money. I mean, look at most politicians. Even if a politician ends up starting with very little, they end up very quickly having large war chests full of money. And in the ancient world, it was no different. A king could accumulate large amounts of gold, and this text just says no to that. And this is an anti-wealth remark again, as much as it is not. This is a different kind of king. You're not going to use your position to your own personal advantage in a way that was detrimental to the rest of Israel. So these are the negatives. Now, what's the positive thing? It's when he takes the throne of his kingdom, he's to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priest. It's to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of his law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. So what's going on here? This is a different kind of king. And this is where Israel's king is radically different from the other nations. In the other nations, usually a god is the king, or God would be given lip service. Some god would be given lip service that he's the true king of an area. But then you'd have the king, and then what would happen? The king would rule by creating laws. So in a sense, the king in the nations around Israel would at least give lip service to being under the authority of a god. But in essence, what did the king do? By the ability to actually narrate laws and generate laws, the king was the law. Now, this isn't how Israel did it, though. Yahweh is the true king. And then there's the Israelite king. Oops. And then there's the law, and the King Yahweh is the one that makes the law, the Torah. And then what happens? In Israel's way of doing things, the king comes along, and the king's positive responsibility. This doesn't mean this is the only thing the king did was read scripture all day. But the king's responsibility was to know the Torah and essentially do what? Lead God's people in faithfulness. So in a sense, the king in ancient Israel is more like an administrator, if you want to think of it that way, than a generator of law. So this is the key contribution. This is a different kind of king where really the law is king, really Yahweh's king, and Yahweh reigns through the written law administered by the human king who practices faithful obedience in leading God's people. And notice that he's not supposed to lord it over. So this is more like a servant leadership. The New Testament's going to talk a great deal about this. And the king isn't better than the people. The king is essentially the first among equals. And he's to be first in leading God's people into faithful obedience. Now, this is critical again because this law sets up an ethical piece. Everything flows out of God's people's response to God's grace, and we respond in faithful obedience as our reaction to God's grace. And God's given the law, and the law leads us into what our response to grace looks like. And the proper role in ancient Israel, according to Deuteronomy, of the king was to lead in faithfulness. It's no wonder that this language that we see in Deuteronomy 17:14 shows up clearly in Joshua 1:8, where Joshua is to take the book of the law. And we also see it, and this, by the way, this is the first of the books of the prophets, Joshua 1:8. Then we see it also in Psalm 1:2, which is the first of the books of the writings. So the idea here that we're to be shaped moment by moment by faithfulness to the Torah permeates through the whole Old Testament. Again, ironically, the counterexample to this ends up being Solomon in 1 Kings, which explains a lot of the narratives that we're going to see about Israel's history in Kings. Again, if you have any questions, let me know, and I look forward to seeing you again in our next video.